Hello, and welcome to Live with MightyHive. Today's episode is Mastering Creative Effectiveness. It's a roundtable discussion featuring Google, MediaMonks, and MightyHive. I will moderate. My name is Miles Younger, Senior Director of Marketing with MightyHive. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. Live with MightyHive, in case you are not familiar, maybe this is your first episode that you've watched. These are information-packed chats with digital media, creative, and analytics experts. And our topics are so wide-ranging, I'm now having trouble packing that into a single tagline. So this tagline is changing with every time I do one of these. You can subscribe at livewithmightyhive.splashthat.com. If you have questions, feedback, episode ideas, anything like that, we would love to hear from you at live@mightyhive.com. Little bit about MightyHive. MightyHive is the leading data and digital media consultancy. We offer services and consulting across digital and programmatic media, analytics, and data strategy. We're a global company with offices in North and South America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. You can see a couple of our esteemed clients there on the right. And if you want to learn more, you can go to mightyhive.com or contact questions@mightyhive.com. A couple of housekeeping notes before we move on. The complete recording and slides will be available later, and there will be a live Q&A at the end. And if you want to ask a question, you can ask a question at any point during the episode, and we'll wait till the end to answer some of them. Use the Q&A button. Don't use like the raise hand feature, the chat feature, whatever other button Zoom is showing you. Use the Q&A button. All right. Let's get started here by offering a little bit of context before I introduce our panel. Creative matters. So this chart is showing some research from Nielsen, showing the respective contribution to campaign performance from across creative, media, and branding. And you can see the media, or I'm sorry, creative, has an outsized impact on performance at 56%, which is pretty significant. Now, there are other studies that have different numbers that break things out a little bit differently, but this has been found in other research that creative has a very significant impact on campaign outcomes. And so in the mind of a digital advertiser, you might just think, well, I'll just keep optimizing my creative to juice my campaign performance. That seems pretty simple. And this is great because creative accounts for 56% of performance. And so if I can make my creative 2 times better, you know, I'm going to have a really big impact on campaign outcomes. However, you know, if we look at a hypothetical of trying to put that idea into practice, we start to run into a couple of issues or challenges that we've got to get around. And so let's run through this. It's a very simple hypothetical, and I apologize ahead of time for the really simplistic graphics here. But let's imagine most marketing organizations, for better or for worse, probably for worse, as we're about to find out from our panelists, creative and media tend to sit separately. So we're going to imagine them on opposite sides of a wall, and maybe this wall is literal, like maybe they're in different buildings, different cities, or maybe it's just sort of figurative. Maybe there is just not as much cross-team literacy or cross-team communication. And so let's imagine them sitting on opposite sides of the wall. And so on the media side of the wall, they've got access to stuff like audience data, contextual data, campaign reporting, all these things that the creative team could use to further optimize and enhance creatives. But in practice, what ends up getting communicated back to the creative team at the beginning of a campaign is usually just lowest common denominator information like creative width by height, you know, stuff like that, basic specs, and that's all they're getting. And so they're really, if they're optimizing, which isn't always the case. They're optimizing a lot of times based on this lowest common denominator info. So you can begin to see how that would hinder any optimizations. So then you take this one step further and you say, well, the creative should ask the media team for more information. But how do they know what to ask for? Seriously, how would they know? Because they're not on the media side. They're on the other side of the wall. And so, and you can run this hypothetical in the reverse, where the creative team has goodies that the media team can't access. And basically you end up with this big chicken and egg problem of where do you get started? How do you bring these functions together? How do you make creative better? How do you make creative more effective? And so this is what we are hoping that our panel today can shed some light on. So with that, I would like to introduce them. Today we have with us 3 panelists. There's Ryan Tetuan from Google. He is head of creative solutions and media platforms. And he brought along with him today some Google Creative Solutions guides that came out relatively recently. And there is a link down there to download them, or if you can't access them, to request access. But there is a lot of material with these within these Creative Solutions guides. There's like 4 of them, and each of them is, I don't know, 20 or 30 pages. This is like a ton of material. I jotted down the 4 things they cover. There's like a foundational one, there's one on measurement, there is one on advanced assets, and then there's another one on dynamic creative. So if you want to dig deeper into anything that Ryan says, I would advise accessing these solutions guides. And then from MediaMonks, we have Louise Martens, Global Head of Embedded Production. And hopefully, as she is giving her remarks, maybe she can, among other things, shed light on how embedded production or embedded teams might impact creative effectiveness. I can only assume she has something to say on that. And then lastly, but not leastly, from Mighty Hive, Mitchell Pok, who is Director of Creative Services and Technology, or as I like to call him, my data-driven creative brother from another mother. He was kind enough to join us today. And so we're going to do a roundtable discussion. We're going to go through a couple of questions, and then, as I said, we'll have some live Q&A at the end. So everybody on our panel, why don't you just say a quick hello to everybody?
Hello.
How's it going, everyone?
Hey, nice to be here.
All right, let us kick off with our first question that, Louise, I am going to give to you. And I want our other panelists to chime in on this for sure. What does creative effectiveness mean? Could you just kind of, at a high level, explain this concept as you see it?
Yeah, sure. Great question to start the panel with because it means different things to different organizations, right? So what it means at MediaMonks is basically creative that is continuously optimized. And in its most simplest form, I would say, thus the work, right? Are our efforts paying off? Are we hitting the goals that we set out together with brands and our partners? And you know, not too long ago, and actually a lot of brands are still seeing campaigning as a quite linear thing, right? There's a start and an end date, and then, you know, you've launched it and you might get some results back or maybe not. And if you get some results back, performance analytics, you have to be lucky that that Excel sheet is somewhat digestible, right? So there's this, it's really difficult sometimes to understand the performance of your campaigns, right? So the way we are approaching it, and I build teams around client problems, so the teams we're building are different, right? We see it as a marketing cycle in which we plan creative efforts, we produce, we create, we launch them, we see how a flight does, we understand the performance of it, we look at this ball of numbers, try to translate that into actionable insights that then the creatives can take and chew on, right? So creative becomes a hypothesis, it becomes more of testing. It's not one big idea anymore. It's several ideas. It's avenues that you test. And as you go through these optimization sprints, you refine. So your creative is as fit for format as it can be, as personalized as it can be, and as relevant, right? And I think here, I come from a creative background. We build these teams together with Mighty Hive, and this is where we're really seeing, fast teams, very nimble, that move through processes just much quicker, much more efficient, and it's much more performance driven than it used to be. So yeah, lots of interesting findings there, and we see that a lot of our clients are struggling to truly put this into practice. So that's why we're here. We're trying to help them sort of get on that constant optimization train. Ryan, your tools at Google are tremendously helpful in that. I'm sure that you might have even a little bit more different definition of what creative effectiveness is. Curious to hear that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you touched on nimble, right? So I think it's creative nimbleness, agile. There's a lot of words that describe the same thing, which is tech will help, right? So we at Google, obviously, we're trying to release products that help creatives and teams be agile. But you called out people and process and workflow, because you can have all the tech in the world, but if you don't have the organizational structure to execute it, or be agile, then the tech isn't going to help you. So yeah, I mean, creative effectiveness for me is almost, creative nimbleness in a way, from a tech and a people and workflow perspective, because that's as important as the tech.
Ryan, quick follow-up to that. So from the MediaMonks and MightyHive side, we're a partner that works with brands. So we have an interest in having their creatives succeed, because that's why they hire us. Google, on the other hand, also has an interest in seeing creatives succeed, but for kind of different reasons. Is Google maintains this whole ecosystem where creative is supposed to be able to thrive. Like, how do you see your role sort of helping advertisers and partners kind of thrive in that environment, given that Google is really just giving everybody the sandbox? And I guess, how do you see your role kind of helping everybody get the most out of their time in the sandbox?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. We obviously work with quite a bit of agencies and marketers trying to use the products. And, we have plenty of certification programs and materials to execute it. But again, I think it comes down to having an organization where and you touched a little bit at the start of the conversation about creative and media. There are going to be aspects of a creative tool that touches media concepts that creatives may not be comfortable with. So beyond sort of getting our tools right, a lot of the work is educating creatives on some of the media inputs and media aspects of a product, and vice versa. Because to your point, creatives aren't going to know what to ask the media teams unless they know what the media teams are using. So I almost think it's almost important for a creative person who's coming into our software platform, maybe look at the media products, right? And I know it's not the topic that may not be super interesting to you, but we have Cliff Notes, right?
Yeah.
And I think, vice versa, from a media to creative content.
Yeah. All right, Mitchell, you chime in here. You're kind of sitting, tell me if I'm wrong, you're kind of sitting in the middle, really. If there's a MediaMonks and there's a Google, you're sort of sitting in the middle and trying to ensure that all this stuff is working well together. Your traffic cop, your consigliere to everybody. So talk about creative effectiveness from that standpoint, or even just kind of the other side of the coin from what Louise described.
Yeah, I think you're right. Kind of sitting somewhere in the middle is how I see my role. And I think that the terrible joke I like to tell is that I'm much more Super Mario than I am Don Draper as a creative director. I connect to data pipes all day. I make sure that teams know what is flowing through those pipes and how that affects the eventual impression or variance that an end consumer may end up seeing. And so, from that perspective, I think kind of combining some of the ideas that Ryan and Louise put out there, I really kind of see creative effectiveness more as more of a mindset or a goal to kind of chase after. There's so many different aspects to what doing effective creative can mean. And kind of given my background more from actually starting on the media and ad ops side of our industry, I was very used to that campaign launch cycle, right? Kind of every quarter you're building kind of very similar. We're targeting campaigns to what ran the previous quarter, prospecting campaigns. You may test out a few new tactics here and there. But by and large, you kind of start to see where is there maybe room for additional efficiencies or automation, or as the way I might put it, how can we maybe modularize and streamline any of our always on activity? I think most marketers or brands can kind of think about, all right, what are we doing that is constantly on? And I think that's maybe a great area where creative effectiveness as a concept can really come to life, because that's where, all right, we know that this is always on, so it's something that we can hopefully always improve upon. So I think looking at your always on activity, determining ways in which you can streamline the actual activation processes, that's what's going to allow teams to then shift from spending so much time on just basic setup, and actually allow them to refocus their time on larger strategic efforts, understanding how, okay, we are testing new tactics. What new creative ideas can we put out there? Hey, we just did this research on the creative side and we now understand what consumers are responding to. Can we actually target that micro moment using the targeting capabilities of the platforms that we're using? So, I think kind of taking it from a more activation or campaign launch process approach, that's how I might think about the concept of creative effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So instead of the wall in the middle, tear it down. Mitchell, he will help bring everybody together. That's awesome. All right. Before we move on to our next question, let's do a little poll. You should see it popping up on your screens. How much do you, or if you're not a brand, or if you're an agency or a vendor, just think of this with respect to your clients, generally speaking. How much do you evaluate and optimize toward creative effectiveness? So we've got three simple answers here. You're iterating, testing, and learning basically all the time. You're doing it sometimes, but probably not regularly, or you're doing it rarely or never. Definitely cast your vote. We would love to just get a better sense of kind of the comfort level, if you will, of the audience today. And then we'll probably come back to that in a couple of minutes once we've got a couple of some results having rolled in. But in the meantime, let's move on to our next question here. And Ryan, I'm going to put this one to you. You kind of started to touch on some of these themes with the previous question, so maybe you can dig into a little bit more. But it's easy to talk about creative effectiveness as a process, as a goal, and talk about it academically. But we got to understand there's barriers to this. There's stuff standing in the way. There are challenges to be overcome. So from your perspective, what are some of the barriers to creative effectiveness?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you a couple slides ago, you had the wall, right? And I think like that is probably the biggest barrier. And for some context, I 15 years ago was at a creative agency, and I'm dating myself here a little bit, but and it was a full service actually agency. So I had media teams within 20 yards of me. There weren't any physical walls, and my interaction with the media team was essentially an email from them with an Excel spreadsheet of sizes of ads to build. Right, that's it. No audiences, contextual data. And I see creative teams on a weekly basis, and for the most part, that still happens, right? So I think that barrier you mentioned is the barrier between creative and media. And it's, it's one that's been there for a long time. It's not going to change overnight. And, when we're talking, data is a word that gets thrown around quite a bit, right? So creators are like, what do you mean? Like, what is data? And I think there's two simple ways to break it down. There's like data inputs and data outputs. For inputs, you mentioned it, it's like simply like as simple as audience targeting. There's terms like, if I hear a creative say first party data, my head explodes. Like, it's amazing creatives even know of that term, but it's a very relevant term now, especially with everything happening in, privacy around our industry. It's becoming a very important term. So you have your inputs, right, which are essentially what levers can I use to be effective with my creative. And then you can't measure effectiveness if you don't have access to measurement, right? If you don't know how is this creative doing, right? I can't have a creative, I can't even get access to a report unless I go tap on the media team's shoulder and, they're busy enough launching the next campaign. So I think access to obviously the input and the output, which is a measurement, is super important and a barrier that still exists.
Yeah. Mitchell, given that you're often in this traffic cop role, what is it you're doing kind of on a daily basis to tear down some of these walls and help, I don't know, build new lines of communication or explain things to people? I know that a lot of your job is literally just explaining what one side does to the other side.
Outside of the role of matchmaker, I do think, there's a large part of kind of bringing these teams together that is really important, because I think, outside of the handoff points that kind of Ryan was alluding to, right? The initial delivery of the banners. All right, cool. We'll see you when we need the banners for next quarter's launch. Those are kind of some of the areas that I try to highlight as, problems, to be frank. So when I see those sorts of things happen, that's where I might look to say, okay, how can we maybe further align and, identify more areas for collaboration? And I think I want to touch on what Ryan said is that there's a lot already going on with any given campaign launch. And I think that while technology has simplified a lot of those things, what you're also seeing is just a sheer proliferation of channels, formats, technical requirements. Eventually, and as we're already starting, AR and VR creatives are going to become potentially the new normal. And I think when you compare that to a more historical approach where we had TV and that was like the one medium, there was a less need and potentially less, potential better outcomes for having those teams collaborate. But in a world now where there's so many digital touch points, it really requires that collaboration. I think further to that point, finding ways to automate and streamline each of those activations across all of your channels. Because I think that's really what is a major blocker in my mind, is just the sheer amount of, hey, to Ryan's point, we're really busy right now. And we don't have time to try and incorporate your additional thoughts or ideas. And that's kind of some of the areas where I'm trying to unblock and make sure that, all right, well, hey, this time around, we do have a lot of time. We've already modularized and automated, XYZ executions. So now we can spend the time for, actually setting up a test and learn program, or actually shifting to an area where we can then focus on education. And I think that's the last piece I'll say is, as far as, say, on the Mighty Hive side, everyone who I hire onto my team goes through media training and creative training. So that's kind of Mighty Hive's full suite of Mighty School, as far as what is an ad server, a media buying platform, what are all the targeting options available. And I think it's just simply knowing what's possible that really helps and allows them to drive the conversations that they need to have with their clients, with their internal teams, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Louise, I'm gonna come to you in just a minute, but I just wanted to come back to Ryan really quick. If you consider that Mitchell is kind of in a role where he's trying to help people become expert users of the tools, of Google tools, what's been Google's kind of process and journey as a maker of that technology in so far that it can help tear these barriers down?
Yeah, we would think like just build a tech platform and that would fix this barrier, right? And that is absolutely not the case. And to be honest, and I'm not sure if our product teams are watching. I love them all, but I would say we missed the mark on one of our launches. So those who use Display and Video 360, which is our DSP, which is a media platform, right? We built a creative platform within that, and it is a beautiful. It's actually a really powerful creative platform. But I think the challenge that we have, and we still have, and we didn't honestly realize this until I think after it launched and we started getting some feedback, is, you know, creatives don't feel comfortable being in a media platform, even though you're building a creative tool in that platform, right? And vice versa, the media teams sometimes aren't as comfortable with creative teams in a media platform, right? Even though we put, you know, we put safeguards in place so creatives weren't seeing media data, cost data, but we did want creatives to see audience targeting, contextual targeting, reporting, right? All the things that creatives have been asking for from that input and data output I suggested. We tried solving by getting creatives in a media platform, and they weren't going. And that's, you know, I think that was a lesson for us. So we're making steps, you know, to change that. And you know, we have seen some successes with that product. I'm not saying it was a fail by any means, and we're still expanding on it. But I think initially we expected this product to fix the barrier, and everyone would come in and there'd be mass collaboration, but that just wasn't the case. Yeah.
No, I as somebody who used to build ad tech and creative tech, I experienced my own versions of all of that. So yeah, I can totally commiserate that it is a thing. It's a laudable goal, but it's by no means easy. Louise, maybe you can tack on to that a little bit with respect to these barriers between you know, advertisers and the goal of creative effectiveness. You know, you're sitting in the MediaMonks world, in the creative side. You know, are you getting the data you need? How could you better get it? Do you have tools that allow you to get it? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers because, you know, we're talking about ads right now, but, you know, if you consider the whole customer journey, you know, you have a .com, you have your e-commerce retailers, yes, you have your display, you have your social, you know, there's a lot. And usually what we see is that the vendor landscape is very scattered, right? So the pure sort of the scale and scope is big, and different parties are developing or designing or managing different platforms. So in order to understand true customer journeys, you need the data, the signals to be able to flow freely. And I call that the plumbing. Mitchell will laugh at me for saying that, but the plumbing, it's actually not that sexy, but it's making sure that the taxonomy across your whole ecosystem, whoever develops or manages it, is the same. So as a marketeer, you can make sense of what you're seeing, because your consumers, your customers will interact with your brand in a very erratic way. It's again, not linear, right? So to make a meaning of that, you know, the source of the data, the touch points are many, and that is a difficult operational challenge. Mm-hmm. So even if you get creatives and media to play nice, which is totally possible, we're doing that. That's a huge step forward. But then the next challenge becomes, what about the website? What about our app? What about in-store? What about, right? And then connecting that one by one. What about our Amazon strategy, right? And I think that's where not a lot of people often realize what a heavy lift it is to connect all of it together through really, you know, the hygiene of excellent taxonomy. And that, I think, is sometimes a barrier. It is one that you can overcome, but it's a much more operational barrier than you think. Yeah. And it ties into what type of platforms you're using, whether it's Google or Adobe or any types of platforms, right? It's just making sure that they communicate, so creative teams, media teams, marketeers can look at the bigger picture without it being super fragmented. And
Yeah.
I think that's just a difficult, it's a heavy lift, but we're working through it, and it's working, but it's not to be underestimated.
Yeah. Well, and on the topic of taxonomy, for everybody watching, I think the recording should be live soon. That's actually our previous episode. The whole episode was on data taxonomies. We had Jeff Rasp from Bayer on. He's a super interesting fellow and very passionate about taxonomy, if you can imagine that is a thing to be passionate about. But yeah, you can begin to imagine if the media and creative team, even if the columns in the report are named differently, you're just going to run into friction there. And so it's something you have to pay attention to. Okay, moving on. And for the audience, I think maybe this was scheduled at a half hour. Clearly we are running long. I hope you stick around. This is super interesting, this conversation. So next question here is going to go to you, Mitchell. What's the biggest creative effectiveness opportunity you see today? What do you see? Is there something advertisers are leaving on the table? Is there low-hanging fruit? What's out there for the taking?
Yeah, I think that is a good question, and maybe the theme I'm starting to sense from the discussion so far is that collaboration really is a major goal that a lot of brands should have. And so I think first and foremost, as a brand, maybe encouraging and to some extent requiring their media and creative and analytics teams, I think, as we're just touching on taxonomy, to really work together from the start. And so, by kind of forcing them, in a sense, to sit down at the table and have a discussion around, say, a campaign brief or around an upcoming launch, that's what's going to allow them to reconnect the dots in terms of identifying any potential synergies between those media plans and creative concepts, right? Some of the examples we gave earlier. And I think incentive-wise, there's actually a recent Google study that I'd seen that showed there's about a 1.5x increase in overall campaign performance when creative strategies are aligned to media compared to when creative is built in a silo. So I think right off the bat, there's a very easy win of just, scheduling these meetings, asking these teams to really work with each other and bring to the table ways that they want to work more with the media team. So as a creative, really being confident in asking for that media performance data, not just from historical campaigns, but setting the road for actually getting it during whatever upcoming flight will be happening. And I think I might call this general idea of like killing the idea of a drop or a asset delivery. I really want that as a concept to hopefully be something that shifts where brands are both, where creative agencies and teams are able to deliver assets at the start of the campaign, but then they're in the loop the entire way through that flight so that they can actually have the opportunity to make those sorts of mid-flight iterations, which I think is something that, on the media buying side of things, back when I was optimizing campaigns, I can optimize media targeting tactics and the keywords and audiences all day. But ultimately, if the creative is poor quality, as you started with that stat, there's only so much that you can do. So to sum that all up, I would say that, relating to a campaign activation process, it really starts with that briefing. So maybe using that as a mechanism to get the teams to collaborate more, essentially briefing the same brief to all three teams, allowing them to maybe push back on certain areas, provide additional areas or thoughts on how that brief could evolve, and then realigning on that so that all three teams or anyone else who you might consider in the mix has this aligned, unified, shared vision of what everyone's trying to achieve. And then, from a concept of extreme ownership, doing everything that they can to make sure that even though I'm creative, I want to make sure that the media teams are using as great as possible targeting tactics. They're bringing in the latest audiences. They're making use of all the latest research that we've done, and vice versa across all of these teams.
Yeah. All right. In the interest of time, we're going to compress this, Ryan, for you and Louise. Louise, you first, in like 10 words or less. What's the biggest opportunity that you see with respect to creative effectiveness? If you had a wish list and it's the number one thing on your wish list, what is it? Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted. I think the biggest opportunity, it's actually what I consider the lowest hanging fruit, is video optimization. I think if you just start with how are my videos performing on YouTube and how are we creating assets that are fit for format for a 6-second, whatever seconds it is, right? That is where we see the biggest results, the biggest brand lifts, ad recall, conversion, drop in cost per conversion. The results are so stunning that if I would have one tip, I would say, look at a pilot on your YouTube or your social video, because usually you have access to the data. It's quite straightforward, and you can actually, by implementing best practices, really, really make a big difference that you'll feel in impact and financially as well. So that would be my first takeaway. There's more, but that is for me, the lowest hanging fruit.
No, I love that. Yeah, YouTube and social video, start there, and sounds like there's just a ton of upside, which makes total sense to me. I mean, video, that's an extremely impactful format, so it makes sense. All right, Ryan, number one thing on your wish list in terms of the opportunity you see out there?
I think cloning Mitchell and Louise and just placing them around the ecosystem would be helpful, which is probably unrealistic. But just as simple as your media strategy team is having a meeting, bring a creative in. When the creative team is having a strategy meeting, bring a media person in. That's it. I mean, just a very simple, and they're going to feel uncomfortable and maybe weird, but it's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, you should develop some icebreakers. That would be sort of a funny way to make that happen. You can send it out to all your partners and clients. Hey, we got some poll results came back in. So, all right. With respect to how much do you or your clients evaluate and optimize creative effectiveness? We had 41% of people say they do it basically all the time. That's pretty good. That's over 4 out of 10. I'd say that's not bad. About half say sometimes, but not regularly, which is where I would have assumed most marketers would fall. And then thankfully, only 10% said rarely or never. So congratulations to everybody for generally being okay on this. But naturally, there's always room for improvement. Even those people who are doing it all the time, I'm sure there's other stuff that they would want to do better. All right, so moving along, I think let's skip this question because we've talked quite a bit about the role that technology plays. I don't think we need to rehash this one. So we'll skip right to our final question, our fifth and final question that I'm hoping to get input from all three of you, and hopefully maybe make your answers a little bit concise. Our audience is being super patient and hanging around, and we want to get to Q&A. And maybe there's some flavors of your answer to the last question of where should a brand get started? This sounds like a very long process. There's a lot of elements here. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. Louise, why don't you go first and give us your 2 cents on where a brand can get started here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the video pilots is where I would say just make that an individual sort of effort, try that out. Educating your teams on best practices. Every channel, every platform has best practices that really, really help. Like for instance, on YouTube ads, put a face in the first 2 seconds and you'll see view-through rate improve. Things like that exist, the ABCDs. Make sure that your creatives understand that, your marketeers as well. So that leads me to fit for format thinking, right? Think about the channels and the pros and the cons of every channel. Make sure your creative fits there. And I think Mitchell alluded to it in the beginning, always on content or always on work streams are usually much easier to restructure from an operational point of view. So getting your stuff in line on always on efforts is easier. So that's also a more logical place to start. And then, the briefings, we've talked about this a little bit. The way you brief, you can force a lot in that briefing, right? And set the tone for how people should collaborate and what the expectations are there. Yeah. I think that is it in a super condensed version.
Thank you. All right, so Mitchell, I know RFPs, briefs are one of your passion points here. So maybe you can just dig into that for a minute. and let us know where you think brands can get started there.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think I was going to echo a lot of what Louise touched on. I think the ideas of fit for format definitely super important. But yeah, as it relates to the briefing process, I think it's just something where, as far as that brief, creative teams and media teams should hopefully receive maybe something like the same brief. They might need additional details that are obviously different for each team. But I think there is value in having a creative team understand the goals of the media team or whoever may end up winning that part of an RFP or campaign strategy. So, as it relates to where can a brand get started and where can they get a lot of, results from trying to force some of this collaboration, as Lisa's saying, I think there's a lot of, opportunity in terms of setting up these goals or, tasks that really result in collaboration, right? Like if you need to run, say, actual A/B tests, that's going to require alignment across all three teams just kind of naturally. And then I think, more to that point, requiring that a creative team is, say, iterating on whatever is delivered at the start of the campaign, halfway through, at whatever point makes sense for the flight. That also then kind of naturally requires then that data is shared with that team during initial flight periods. It ensures that the creative team is staying aware of how their creatives are performing and aren't just getting a report, if at all, at the end of the campaign. So to sum that all up, I'd say brief the teams and give them as much context as possible. Ask those teams and potentially set up incentives for actually having them collaborate and asking for those ways to really extend their strategies together. So
yeah, no, it's interesting to see how the briefing process itself is sort of almost this like choke point, check-in point where you get a chance to fix a lot or break a lot potentially, depending on the kind of choices you make. Okay, Ryan, you get the last word here. Where do you think a brand ought to get started on creative effectiveness?
I'm just going to plug some resources if that's okay.
Please.
First one you called out is our creative solutions guides, right? And I think you posted a link to that, which are great. The other place, if you just Google Skills Shop, we actually have an entire library of Google Marketing Platform content, whether it's Google Web Designer, any of our creative products. But as I said earlier, like if you are a creative, sure, you're absolutely going to dig into the creative aspects of it. But you know what? Take a look at the display and video 360, right? Media stuff. Take a look at the campaign manager, which is ad serving, ad trafficking. Like all those, with our software, the power isn't in one product alone. It's the interconnectedness of all of them, right? And if you're talking about data and media working together, or creative and media, then it's actually, you need the platform to do the same. So I would do that. Again, so just Google Skillshop and you'll see plenty of content there. Yeah, and I would say just last word on that, once you feel like, okay, I sort of get the hang of this and I'm gonna, what we see often is like, okay, I'm gonna launch a dynamic creative campaign. I'm gonna start with like 10 iterations of copy and 10 iterations of images and 10 calls to action, and you multiply all that together and you have 1,000, is that right? 10 times 10?
Yeah.
1,000 iterations of creative, and that's probably too much, right? Like start small, try 5 different images. One's working better, okay, take that and start iterating further than that with a different copy line or call to action. So I think don't boil the ocean, start small and have small wins and go from there.
Yeah, and I am sure that the four of us could have a whole productive side conversation just on that question of the 1,000 iterations problem. But we'll kind of move on and start to wrap up here. So it is time for Q&A. We'll spend a couple of minutes on this. To our audience, I hope you can stick around for another couple of minutes and as we run through a couple of questions live. Use that Q&A button on your screen, and let's have a look and see what has come in. I know I saw something here. Oh, okay. So let's see. Ryan and Mitchell, this is one that came in. It might be better suited to you. So this question says, the Nielsen study at the beginning says that creative is 54, maybe it was even 56% of performance, brand and media in second and third. But if you look at an attribution model, the order is often different. Do you agree with that? That might be kind of tough to answer, so I won't put you on the spot for that one necessarily, but do you have any thoughts on the discrepancy? And I mean, this has to do with a lot of inner workings of the tech stacks. And so anyway, not to put you too much on the spot with a kind of a technical question, but I do think it is kind of an interesting question. And I know it's very hard to measure the relative contributions of these things. So let me know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to take a first stab at it, it is actually a little bit more apples and oranges of a comparison, because I think when we're talking about the Nielsen study and those statistics, it's in terms of overall campaign inputs, right? So all things the same, the media plan and its overall impact on campaign performance, the brand itself and where they may sit within the market, its contribution to campaign performance, and then the actual creative is what can drive the largest maybe delta in that overall campaign performance. When I think about attribution and, the specific example that was given, one, realistically, that creative, the way that they're, I guess it's going to depend on by platform, but really what I'm kind of hearing is that attribution modeling is more for, like, to be frank, channel media allocation. That's really what you're kind of using those sorts of attribution reports for. And so, when it comes to looking at, say, creative performance data, it's not really a fair comparison, I guess. So I guess, as far as the question goes, I'd say, obviously, attribution is an important concept, and I think that should and could drive your media allocation across tactics, channels, so on and so forth. But as it relates to creative, I think it might be a bit of a red herring.
Yep. Yeah. No, I was wondering if there was something there with respect to sort of statistical methodology, those being kind of two different things. Ryan, if you have anything to add to that, please do, but don't feel like you have to.
Mitchell killed that one. Yeah, so I don't. I just think attribution obviously is going to get harder with cookies. So yeah, plus 1,000 everything Mitchell said. I don't really have much to add on that.
Cool. Okay. Next one, Louise. I think this is probably best suited for you. Thank you again for an insightful discussion. That's the first comment here in this question. So thank you, everybody. What is the best way to ingest asset performance signal data to your creative agency partner within the process versus at the end of a campaign?
Yeah, I mean, how we do it is we tend to look at like a minimum of 1 week as flights, right? So I would say do it on a weekly cadence. And usually those types of reports make sense. That's long enough to see some trends. And that's still short enough to be agile about pivoting if you see something is not working. So if media and creative live under one roof, I think that's quite straightforward to set up. If it's different partners, that might need some help. But yeah, installing that cadence, installing those meetings around that until that becomes the new normal, I think is great, especially for teams that look over always on efforts, right? Mm-hmm. Campaigns or efforts that are always going to be ongoing, that need to be refined, optimized on a non-stop basis. So yeah, we take a week usually. Mitchell, do you have other opinions about that?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add on that, as far as the ways in which you can, share or as a creative agency ingest, I think it's one, knowing to ask for it and, working with the brand to make sure that, any media teams or ad ops teams are able to provide those reports. But I think, as we've gone through that process of sharing reports, that's not necessarily enough. Where, I think maybe to Ryan's points around just overall comfort with the data or just kind of being comfortable with understanding what the heck they may even be looking at, that's where I think dashboarding can really help. And if you're on the creative side of things, figuring out what sort of report is actually useful for your creatives, right? How do they want to look at the data? They think, as Ryan was saying with like platforms, creatives didn't necessarily want to be within a media platform. And I think when it comes to like looking at campaign data, it can very quickly become something that just looks like a wall of numbers. And you're like, all right, well, like this isn't helpful for me. So I'd say as far as ingesting that performance, coming up with your own template on the creative side, and then, if you're the media partner, there are a lot of very simple tools for setting up these dashboards, whether it be Data Studio or something like it that is very easily connected to your campaign data and can then be shared as a kind of auto-updating, always live link. So maybe just a few additional details there.
Cool. Okay. So we're going to do one more question. And this actually, Mitchell, where you took that question segues perfectly into this last question that we're going to do. And Ryan, I'll give this one to you first. So this question says, when looking at creative effectiveness across multiple ads and campaigns to campaign KPI, is there a self-serve tool or report that performs this, or are data scientists needed to perform the analysis? I don't know if you have anything to say with respect to DV360 and the way that you baked in the studio module, or as Mitchell pointed out, Data Studio. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's yes, I mean, all of our, you call it DV360 has reporting. Campaign Manager also has reporting across campaigns. So there are those standard tools that I think we'll get to some of the answer here. The one thing I did want to plug here was a measurement guide that we all work together on with the S4 team that covers actually some pretty advanced measurement opportunities that I think could make sense here. So the one specifically I'm referring to is essentially using our cloud-based solutions, right? So what it does is it's using, not to go too technical in the weeds here, but our Google Vision API, right? Which can look at images and at scale can look at 1,000 images. It can tell you in those images, okay, what are the objects? Are there faces? Are there emotions? Copy, color. And taking that data and mapping it against Campaign Manager, which will give you that reporting like I suggested. And marrying those will actually generate data that will give you not only creative effectiveness at the ad side, at the overall ad, but creative effectiveness at the asset level, right? So you'll learn things like, for some reason having, if you're a retailer, having 2 product shots versus 4, for some reason, whatever, who knows why it works, but it does across campaigns. So that's an advanced tool. You'll see it in the measurement guide. But I think the one, and we didn't get to this question, but tech will help this, but I still think there is an aspect of human intervention, right? So the tech may tell you that, for some reason, 2 people shaking hands or a crowd of people together, for some reason, works really well. Well, guess what? That imagery in the past 3 or 4 months during a global pandemic, probably not the best to put in your ad. So I think while tech is going to solve some of that, I think there is, you need a Louise, you need a Mitchell, you need actually humans to understand context there as well. So I don't, hopefully that answers some of it. But yes, the products have it, and then I would have a look at that measurement guide, which goes other than the cloud-based solution I mentioned. There's a ton of stuff. It's one of our best guides, so have a look at that.
Cool. Okay, and with that, we'll basically wrap up here. And those guides are linked here again. I want to say thank you to all 3 of our panelists, Ryan, Louise, Mitchell. This has been outstanding. I had high expectations for this episode, and we have definitely exceeded them. So yeah, that measurement guide is behind that bit.ly link that's right there in Ryan's bullet point there. So I definitely recommend going to check those out. Really, they are quite in-depth. If you have any random questions for Louise or Mitchell, their email addresses are right there. I'm sure they would be happy to geek out on creative effectiveness with you. So Thanks once again to everybody for the panelists for participating, for our audience for showing up and sticking around for kind of a marathon episode. We really do appreciate it. If you haven't yet, you can subscribe to Live with Mighty Hive at livewithmightyhive.splashthat.com or contact us at live@mightyhive.com. And we look forward to seeing you on some future episode. Okay, all of us, we can all say bye now. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.